Here, turn first to Luke chapter 7. We're gonna end up in John 13, but I want to begin here this evening. We're glad for those of you that are visiting with us. Hope you're doing well. Hope that our study tonight will be of some profit to you. There's a couple of things that happen in Luke chapter 7 that I find very interesting as we look, and we're gonna kind of do some stuff with regards to our theme tonight, the idea of Jesus as a servant and what we can learn about how we're to be living our lives because of Jesus as a servant. In Luke chapter 7, at the end of the chapter, Jesus is invited to the house of Simon the Pharisee. And you're familiar with the story. I assume you're familiar with the story. He comes in, sits down to eat, and while they are eating, a woman from the town who's simply identified as a sinner, someone who is known as such, she comes and gets down behind Jesus and begins washing his feet with her tears and wiping his feet with her hair, and then anointing his feet with a flask of fragrant oil. And as this is going on, Simon the Pharisee is watching this, and she is ceremonially making Jesus unclean in his mind. And Simon's looking at it one way, Jesus is looking at it another way, ends up forgiving her sins. What I want you to appreciate is there's a certain degree of propriety in what this woman is doing. I don't know how much she recognized about who Jesus really was, but even if all she thought was that Jesus was the Messiah, and I think that was probably more commonly accepted than maybe we suspect, that people really believed that this was going to be their deliverer. And if that's what she believed, there is some degree of propriety in the fact that she is bowing down before him and in the most servile way possible, showing her affection for him, just without regard to any of her own pride or circumstance. And when we look at that and realize Jesus is God, and Jesus is the King of the universe, and Jesus will rule everything through the judgment day until the resurrection when he turns the kingdom back, the rule of the kingdom back to the Father, that would be an appropriate thing for that woman to do. In fact, Simon needs to be down right beside her. There's another incident in the same chapter, earlier in the chapter, when the centurion's servant becomes ill and he sends representatives to Jesus, and Jesus tells him, "I'll come." And the centurion sends word and says, "No, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof. All you have to do is say the word." It's interesting to me that Luke portrays these people in this chapter in a way where they recognize their position before God. And we would do well to spend our evening talking about the need for all of us to recognize our position before God. I use that because there is this drastic contrast. If you turn over to John chapter 13, and Devin used this chapter a few weeks ago to talk about Jesus as an example for us, and he touched on some of the things that we're going to talk about, but I want to talk to you about the idea of service and what we see in John 13 in regards to the concept itself. Now, this goes hand in hand with our memory verse for the month from Matthew chapter 20. I know it's not the fancy package that Devin has up there, but it's the same information if you want to say this together with me. Whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. I want you to look at John 13, and I want you to appreciate this stark contrast between these people who recognize who Jesus is and fall down at his feet. And you see this actually a number of times throughout the Gospels. A very appropriate gesture. And the contrast between that and John 13, where Jesus is the one falling down at the feet of the apostles. And so John tells us in John chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper, laid aside his garments, took a towel, and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. He came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? And Jesus answered and said to him, What I'm doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Peter said to him, You shall never wash my feet. And Jesus answered him, If I do not wash you, you have no part with me. So Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but my hands and my head. And Jesus said, He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew who would betray him, therefore he said, You're not all clean. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, sat down again, he said to them, Do you know what I've done to you? You call me Master and Lord, and you say, Well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you should do as I have done. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. I do not speak concerning all of you. I know whom I've chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled, he who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. Now I tell you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe that I am. And in italics, he is added there. It's always interesting to me that John says things the way that he says, and he may simply be saying, you may know that I am. Same way he does back in John 8. Okay, so what's the point here? This is one of the more poignant pictures of Jesus in the Scriptures. And it is offered in a particular circumstance, under particular conditions, at a particular time, to a particular group of people, in such a way that it strikes us, or at least strikes me anyway, as terribly inappropriate. And yet, this is as graphic a portrayal of God in His service to man as you'll find anywhere in the Scriptures. And I want to make some observations from this. Some simple things that we can learn about service just from this passage of Scripture. And I've got a bunch of them, and that's the only reason I'm using PowerPoint, okay? Because if it was just 3, I would expect you to remember 3, but you're not going to remember all these, so I'm writing them down. So get your pen out if you want them. Here's the first thing I want you to notice. As this chapter begins, John tells us that when Jesus knew his hour had come, in the first verse, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And what he does for them in washing their feet is something that we look at as this wonderful example of what it means to humble yourself. And this is really the point that Devin underscored a few weeks ago. I want you to appreciate why Jesus humbled himself at this point. He humbled himself and he washes their feet because of his affection for these men. If you stop and think about what's going on, this is the night of the Last Supper. Whether it's already happened, I guess it has. He says supper having ended. So we've already gone through all of the events that you and I understand happening relative to the Passover feast and the institution of the Lord's Supper. And it's at this point that Jesus undertakes this gesture. This is a significant night in Jesus' life, folks. It is perhaps the most significant night in Jesus' life. The Passover would have started at dusk, so now we're into the evening hours, however long it takes. And it's just going to be a few hours when Jesus is going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's going to be arrested by this mob of people. And that's going to start the trial. And he's going to go before two different high priests. And he's going to go from Pilate to Herod and back to Pilate. And he's going to have all these accusations. And Peter is going to deny him in a very visible way. And then he's going to, as the trial ends, he's going to be scourged. He's going to be mocked. He's going to be beaten. He's going to be paraded through the streets. Perhaps within 12 hours, he's going to be hanging on a cross. And he knows that. I think that's what John's trying to tell us when he says, when Jesus knew his hour had come, that he should depart from the world to the Father. Now let me ask you something. When you're in the midst of what you know is going to be a terribly hard event in your life, whatever event you want to put, nothing that we will ever face in our life will match what Jesus faced on this night. But we all have hard, difficult things that we know we're going to have to do. What are you thinking about leading up to the time of whatever your difficulty is? The chances are you're not thinking about everybody else. The chances are pretty good we're thinking about what we're about to face. And we find that very natural. Brace yourself. Get yourself ready. This is going to be a hard thing. Get your mind set. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but the thing that strikes me about Jesus is on the night of his betrayal, and remember how hard this was. In a couple of hours when he goes to Gethsemane, Luke's going to tell us that his agony was such that when he was praying, his sweat became as blood. And that's a physical phenomenon where the capillaries actually burst because of tension and stress, and literally you bleed. And that's what was going on with Jesus. This was hard for him. Ask God repeatedly to dismiss this event, this passion that he's going to have to go through. This is hard. But an important thing we learn about service is that service is selfless no matter how challenging the circumstances of life are. How do you get there? How do you become selfless when it's our tendency at critical points in life to only think about ourselves? You do that out of love. And that's why John begins this the way he begins it. That Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, loved them to the end. Love is a determination to put the needs of someone else before our own. And emotion has nothing to do with it, and circumstance has nothing to do with it, and whatever's going on in our life has nothing to do with the idea that I'm going to serve somebody else because I love them. It may not be an emotional thing. Agape love is not necessarily an emotional kind of love. It is a determination of mind. So I want you to appreciate when Jesus, for instance, in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 says, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. And we talk about this regularly. I say to you, love your enemies, bless those that curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who despitefully use you and persecute you. That's where service begins. And until you and I develop this mindset that says, I'm going to love people. I'm going to decide to love people. And that's not always an easy thing for some reasons that we're about to talk about. But until we get that mindset, we're never going to serve the way God expects us to serve, the way that Jesus served. And so, point number one, I want you to appreciate that the very foundation of service is this love that we are told Jesus had for his apostles. Look at the next couple of verses. Now, I want you to notice that in verse 3, John tells us something else about Jesus that's hinted at in verse 1. But in verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God. When you get down to verse 12, Jesus elaborates a little bit on this idea when he says, you call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. I want you to appreciate that if we're really going to take the example of Jesus as a servant and it's going to manifest itself in our life as disciples, then we have to realize that it doesn't matter who we are. The service is not impacted by our standing in life or our status or our stature. And John reminds us that Jesus knew exactly who he was. It is a curiosity to me to know what Jesus understood about his identity at different stages of his life. And you'll hear people talk about, when did Jesus know? Did he know as a baby, as an infant that he was? I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is on this night, when Jesus is about to die, knowing full well all the things that are about to happen to him, he knew exactly who he was. He knew he had come from God. He knew he was going back to God. He knew he was God. And he tells the apostles, you call me teacher and you call me Lord. And probably, if there's more conversation there, he would have said something like, you have no idea how right you are. I'm not just the Messiah, I am God. And I tell you, that is something that I think we need to appreciate. If you go over to Luke's account of the crucifixion, which again is going to take place just in a matter of hours. Do you remember that Jesus tells the thief on the cross, today you're going to be with me in paradise? I mean, if you know you're going to be with God in paradise in just a few hours, don't you think that would be a little distracting to you? And that's where Jesus is. He knows that he's the king. He knows that he's God. He knows he came from God. Just a few chapters earlier, probably a fairly short time earlier, he's been transfigured on the Mount of Transfiguration, appears with Moses and Elijah in glory. God says, this is my son. Listen to him. God has reminded him over and over and over of who he is and where he is going, and yet he doesn't hesitate when supper is over to take off whatever his typical garb was and to put on a towel, which is what a servant would have worn, and get down on his knees at the feet of these men who were arguing on this very night about which one of them would be the greatest. Appreciate the irony. Here's the greatest among them down at their feet, washing their feet. And Peter recognizes that this is not Jesus' place. But I want you to appreciate, regardless of place, service has to take place. And I'll be honest with you, I think sometimes that comes between us and stuff that we ought to do as God's children. Pride sneaks up on us, folks, and it can sneak up in strange ways. When we're called to do things that we don't particularly want to do, or we don't have time to do, or we don't like it. I'm that way. I suspect that you're that way. And the reality is we're never too great, and we're never too important, and we're never too esteemed, and we're never too accomplished to be people who go and serve. That's where greatness is. That's what our memory verse is all about. The apostles are thinking of themselves in terms of status. And Jesus says, I'll tell you where status is in my kingdom. Status is the people who don't pay attention to who they are. They just go help where they can help. So let's remember that we learn from here that service is not impacted by status. I want you to look at the next consideration. When we get to verse 4 and 5, Jesus takes water, he pours it into a basin, and he begins to wash their feet. And this is something else I think that we need to underscore in this, and maybe this is the thing that catches our attention the most, and that is that service doesn't consider how menial the activity is. By the way, meniality is not in the dictionary. It is a word I made up, and I made it up because it's a really, really good word, okay? It doesn't matter how servile the activity is. And I think between the pride of who we are and the degree of humility demanded by the activity, that's sometimes what gets in our way when it comes to serving other people. Jesus is washing their feet. God, can you imagine that? I get Peter here. I really do. It's beyond me to think that God would stoop down at my feet while I'm reclining at table and start washing my feet. And I just can't envision, I can't envision much more a humiliating activity than that. And I recognize that the cross was the ultimate humiliation. And I think sometimes we don't see that for what it was. Hebrews chapter 12 says that Jesus despised the shame of the cross, because among the Jews and the Romans, there was nothing more shameful than being crucified. And yet, I want you to appreciate this is something Jesus is actively doing in order to show His love and His service to these people, and it is about the lowest thing He could have done for them. So let me ask you this question. Is there a line that you draw that says, I'll help other people right up to here? I'll do anything you ask me to do, but not that. That's a challenge for us. And I don't know what the demands may be in your life. I don't know what the demands may be for this congregation. I don't know what the demands may be going forward. But if Jesus can get down on His knees and wash the feet of these men, one of whom is rejecting Him and betraying Him, how is it that we can ever put a limit on what we won't do in regards to service for other people? You know, one of the things that got people's attention about Jesus was this aspect of His character. Luke chapter 15, the Pharisees criticize Him because he's taken time to actually pay attention to the publicans and the sinners. Both Matthew and Mark record Jesus at the house of Levi, Matthew, the tax collector. And again, the Pharisees criticizing Him to His disciples. Your master's eating with horrible people. And it's the passage where Jesus says that, the people that are sick are the ones that need a physician. Jesus has left us example after example after example that says it doesn't matter what the task is. Service doesn't consider what's being asked. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember if we're going to be the people God wants us to be. We have to be willing to do anything to serve. Next one, go back to verse 5 if you would. See, I told you there's going to be a bunch of these. I've already gotten through 3 points. Are you impressed? And there's no clock back there, but for those of you who, it's 25 till, okay? Been up here for 15 minutes, all right? I want you to appreciate that service doesn't discriminate. Of all the things that take place in John chapter 13, this is what impresses me the most. When Jesus takes the towel off and tells us that He began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with the towel with which He was girded, which is its own, He's got this towel wrapped around Him, and now all the grime and grit and everything that's on the apostles' feet is on Him. Okay? And He does this and He goes around the room. At this point, Judas is still there. And honestly, I don't know how He did that. Verse 21 tells us that He knew exactly who would betray Him and what was going to happen. He tells us in verse 2, John tells us that the devil's already put it into Simon's heart. But when you get to verse 21, Jesus is troubled in spirit and says, I say to you, one of you will betray me. And all the disciples look around, perplexed about whom He spoke. Now, if you take Luke's account and put it in right here, which I think is probably where it goes, they begin to argue about which one of them is the greatest as they try to figure out who it is that's going to betray Jesus. Eventually, Peter, who is next to John, who is up against Jesus, Peter motions to John and asks John to ask who it is. And so he leans back in verse 25 and says, who is it? And Jesus says, it's he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I've dipped it. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot and tells him, what you do quickly. Right after he'd washed his feet. Could you do that? Just in all honesty, I'm not sure I could. I'm not sure if I knew somebody was going to betray me. And especially it's going to result in my death. Have you ever been betrayed by a friend? That's a special kind of hurt. That there's not anything else much that I can describe that I've felt like that in my life. Betrayal by someone that you trusted. And that's what's going on here. And you look at that and go, why did Jesus still wash his feet? And you might say, well, Jesus is up to the I've heard people make this argument, up to the very last minute, Jesus trying to save Judas. Here's something to think about. Jesus knew he wasn't going to stop this. He can wash his feet all day long. He's not going to change Judas's mind at this point. He knows that because he's God and he knows what's going to happen the rest of the evening. And so washing his feet, Jesus knows is going to accomplish nothing in regards to Judas. So why does he do it? I think of two things that are very poignant here. Because this is going to make an impact on the apostles. Can you imagine 40 days later after the resurrection when Judas has hung himself and they're trying to, in Acts chapter 1, replace Judas? And there's 120 or so people there, many of whom would have in some way been qualified, and they boil it down to two guys. And don't you know they thought a lot during that time about all they had been through and where they had been and which men among the 120 disciples there come closest to all that they had been exposed to. And they had to think about Judas a good bit. You want to know part of what Jesus wants them to think about when they think about Judas, who's always identified as the betrayer. Always identified as the betrayer. That's the way the apostles saw him. Jesus wants them to remember that Jesus still washed his feet. And that's service on a scale, folks, that goes beyond what most of us will ever be asked to render. And I think the other reason he does this for us. Because hopefully we will look at this and go, how can I ever say no to anyone about service that I might be able to offer to them as a child of God? There are a lot of scriptures that talk about the idea or refer to the idea of discrimination. You can look at the Good Samaritan. It is discrimination that's the very heart of the idea of loving your neighbor and showing mercy, which is what service does. You can go to James chapter 2, where you have the beggar man that comes into the assembly and he's treated unjustly. Or you can look at the admonitions in Peter about being lights in the world, even when we are persecuted or when people speak evil against us. I'm going to tell you something, folks. There are no limitations that we can put upon our service, and we cannot withhold it no matter who it is, because we are being lights in the world. And so service doesn't discriminate. I want you to look at verse 14, 15, 16. And if so far you're looking at this and listening and you still feel like that this doesn't apply to you for whatever reason, I don't know how at this point you couldn't. I want you to appreciate that Jesus tells them, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. I've given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant's not greater than his master, nor is he who sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. We need to recognize, folks, that this is not optional. And I do think it's easy to reason away some of the demands that God makes of us. I think we do this with evangelism. I think it's very easy to do with evangelism. I think it's easy to do with local congregational activity. If we're not into the Ephesians 4 category where you have some talent for teaching the Word, very often we feel like within a local congregation that we really don't have very much that we can do. And so rather than engaging ourselves in any way possible, we just kind of come and go and float in and float out. And we don't really become active in the church. We just are spectators in regards to the regular worship in the congregation. And part of the reason I think we do this is because we know God gives disciples different gifts. He says it in regards to miraculous gifts, 1 Corinthians 12 and 13 and 14. He says it in Romans chapter 12 in regards to gifts that aren't miraculous, whether it's leadership or even people who are specially gifted when it comes to service, ministry. And we look at that, I think it's easy to look at that and think, well, I don't have that gift, so I don't have that responsibility. And we're really good at this argument. You run over to Matthew chapter 25, so the parable of the talents, you know. We're not all 5-talent guys. Some of us are just 1-talent people. And we're only expected to do what we have the talent to do. Oh, okay. I'll grant you that. If you don't have the ability to teach, I don't know necessarily that God's going to hold you accountable because you never got up in a local congregation and preached or taught Bible classes. That's okay. But none of us have an out when it comes to service. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. And there's no asterisk there where you can go down to the bottom of the page and say, unless you're not very good at it. If you're not very good at it, you can be blessed and not do them. Well, what he's saying is, blessed here is like the Beatitudes. This is our standing before God. Are you concerned about your standing before God? Are you? So if God says you're standing before God, if Jesus says you're standing before God is depending upon your doing what I'm telling you right now. I've given you an example of service. It's an example that carries all these issues. It grows out of love. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what the task is. It doesn't matter who it is that needs it. I've given you this wonderful example, and as your master, if I've done it, you ought to be able to do it. And the only way you're going to stand blessed in the eyes of God is if you do this. That's serious. And we need to recognize that all of us fall into this category no matter what our talents are. And that leads me to the last one, and I want you to turn to another passage here. I'm not drawing this point out of John 13. I just think it's a point that needs to be made from a different context. Turn if you would, to Luke chapter 17. In Luke chapter 17, Jesus is offering a warning to the apostles. In many ways, this is parallel to Matthew chapter 18, or at least in Matthew 18, where he's talking about forgiveness and greatness in the kingdom. He uses this illustration of offenses, and it'd be better off that you have a millstone around your neck and you were cast into the sea than you offend one of these little ones. I don't think it's the exact same context as Matthew 18, but he uses the same language. It is, I think, probably in regards to the stubbornness of the Pharisees. If you back up to chapter 15 and 16, the immediate context is they've criticized Jesus for teaching the publicans and sinners. Jesus gives the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost son. And then you get to chapter 16 where Jesus starts talking about putting our confidence in material things because the Pharisees are deriding him. And he tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And then when you get to the end of that, Jesus warns his apostles about offending others, about casting stumbling blocks before them. I think it's all the same context. And their reaction to this in verse 5 is, increase our faith. We don't want to be the people that you're describing here. Increase our faith. Help us. And it's a wonderful plea. I don't think it's inappropriate. And I don't think Jesus is necessarily criticizing them in what he says beginning in verse 6. If you have faith as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, be pulled up by the roots and then be planted in the sea and it would obey you. By the way, I read an interesting comment on this the other day. Notice he doesn't say be thrown into the sea. He says be planted into the sea. Well, you don't plant things in the water and expect them to grow. And this commentator was making this observation. If your faith was what it should be, you could accomplish even things that are impossible. Thought that was an interesting comment. You can chew on that. But that's his reaction to them. And essentially, I think what he's saying is everybody's faith has got to increase. And this is something that you've got to work on. But he cautions them. Which of you having a servant plowing or tending sheep will say to him when he's come from the field, come at once and sit down and eat? Will he not rather say to him, prepare something for my supper and gird yourself and serve me till I've eaten and drunk? Afterward you will eat and drink. Does he thank that servant because he did the things that were commanded him? I think not. So likewise you, when you have done all those things that are commanded, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done what was our duty to do. This is a different context than John 13, but he's talking to the same men with the same ambitions and the same concerns, and they want to be great in their faith. They want to be known, and Jesus offers them this warning. We can do all this stuff that we see Jesus doing in John 13 as we go about our lives, folks. You can spend your day tomorrow searching out every opportunity you can find to serve people around you, whether it's your family, your friends, your brethren, people, strangers you run across. May God help us to be about the business of serving. It is how we accomplish this idea of lights in the world, and we bring people to God. But we need to be really, really careful about thinking that we're important because we serve. It is a curiosity to me that we look for ways to feel like that we're doing it all right. We want to be important to God. Even if it's not an ego important to God, we want to be useful. We want to be profitable. We want to be helpful. We want our faith to grow. We do, and I think many people really want to go out and get better. I think that's why you're here tonight. I think if you weren't interested in getting better, you wouldn't be here on Sunday night. But when it's all said and done, and we've served and served and served and served and served and done everything just like Jesus did, it is important for us to understand that it doesn't earn us anything. None of us still deserve to be saved. None of us deserve the grace of God. None of us deserve the mercy that comes as a result of the grace of God. None of us deserves to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. No matter what we have done, when we are finished with our task, we need to see that we are unprofitable servants who have done what was our duty to do because God has saved us, and that's our job now. And I think there is this, service is one of those measurable things in Christianity that God asks us to do. And I just think we need to be careful and remember that even if we get really, really good at all of this stuff, that we don't start thinking of ourselves as accomplished disciples. We are blessed because of the goodness of God. Amen. And if we've done every possible good thing that you can do in our life, we are still forgiven sinners who do not deserve to go to heaven on our own merit. And so I want to encourage you as you are putting these things into practice that you remember that I'm serving because of who I am, not because of what I get out of it. I'm a child of God, and I'm trying to love because Jesus loved, and I'm trying to serve because God served, and it doesn't matter what I'm asked to do. God stooped down. I can stoop down. And it doesn't matter who it is that I have the opportunity to serve. I cannot hold back because of some kind of distaste or failure of appreciation. And I can't say no. And when it's all done, I still don't deserve the blessings God gives me. May God help us to adopt this very, very powerful image as our own. Because as Jesus tells the apostles in verse 12, do you know what I have done to you? It's imperative that we know and that we go do these things. So as we think about Jesus as our example of service, may God help us to be the servants that He was. Thanks for your attention tonight. 7 minutes till for those of you who have been keeping score. All right?